Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the polished yet painful world of 19th century France, where dentists didn't just yank teeth, they recited poetry while they did it. You're pacing cobbled Parisian streets under flickering gas lamps, weaving between carriages, snuffing out the scent of coal smoke and roasted chestnuts. You pass cafes where men debate metaphysics and molars with equal passion. Dentistry here isn't just a science, it's a spectacle, a philosophy, an art form, and yes, sometimes, a crime against rhyme. You pause at a street corner where a faded sign reads Cabinet Dentaire et Poésie. That's right. In this world, toothaches inspire verses. Gums become metaphors. Canines turn tragic. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourself being serenaded with a sonnet while someone's elbow deep in your jawbone. Romantic, no? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start walking again. The fog is soft and the air's got that metallic scent you'd swear tastes like blood and old brass. Around you, shop signs advertise cures for halitosis and fake ivory dentures so smooth they make your real teeth feel inadequate. It's the 1830s, and dentistry has just started to pull itself out of the medieval muck. No longer just the job of the nearest drunk barber or bored apothecary, it's becoming a profession, with rules, reputations, and most bizarrely, a literary flair. You step inside one of these newer establishments, brass-rimmed windows, velvet curtains, and an overpowering whiff of clove oil. The dentist greets you in a cravat, quoting Racine. Before he even asks what hurts, he launches into a couplet about molars as ivory thrones for royal pain. You start to answer, but, whoops, he's already rhyming enamel with mammal. This is going to be a long appointment. Why poetry, you wonder? Historians still argue whether it was vanity, boredom, or a genuine belief that literature soothed pain better than laudanum. But by the mid-19th century, French dentists had built reputations not only for their skill with pliers but for their lyrical prowess. Publications like Le Chirurgien Dentiste Littéraire actually existed, showcasing professional verse by practicing tooth pullers. Sure, some of it was self-congratulatory nonsense, but some was shockingly moving. Teeth, it turns out, make great metaphors, fragile, stubborn, and always threatening to fall apart at the worst moment. You shuffle through a folder of old pamphlets on the counter, each one a mix of hygiene advice, questionable theories about digestion, and poems with titles like Ode to a Lost Incisor and Elegy for a Rotten Molar. The typography is extravagant, the metaphors more so. One guy describes plaque as the mossy despair of civilization. Another compares gum infection to the slow erosion of reason. And you? You're wondering if it's too late to walk out. But you don't. Because you're curious. And maybe, just maybe, there's something to this bizarre blend of flesh and phrase. After all, the French were doing something new. While the rest of Europe was still ripping teeth out with unwashed tools and muttering prayers, the Parisians were lighting candles, putting on soft music, and quoting Baudelaire. And charging handsomely for it, of course. One fringe tidbit sticks out. Some dentists even held poetry readings as part of their services. Picture this. You're 5 minutes into an excruciating molar extraction, and your dentist is holding your jaw open with one hand and declaiming a sonnet with the other. Was it comforting? Hilarious? Torture? Depends on your taste and rhyme schemes. Outside again, the city hums on. You pass a young woman crying silently on the steps of a closed clinic, maybe from pain, maybe from the beauty of a particularly poignant stanza. A man beside her swears he saw a dentist last week who claimed that reciting an iambic pentameter reduced bleeding. Did it work? Historians still argue whether poetic cadence could lower patient heart rates or if that's just a 19th century placebo. Either way, you're in a world where a lost tooth is a personal tragedy worthy of literature, where dental tools are displayed beside quills, and where somewhere out there, under a moonlit skylight, a dentist is whispering rhymed regrets to a jar of pulled bicuspids. You sit, somewhat reluctantly, on the cracked leather of an old barber's chair, except this one has been rebranded. No longer used for trimming beards or bloodletting, it now serves the more refined, if no less painful, purpose of dental poetry. The room smells like lavender oil and scorched metal. Behind you, a mirror warped with age reflects the twisted silhouette of the man about to inspect your mouth. His apron is clean, his gloves non-existent, and his eyes a little too eager. This, you realize, isn't just a dentist. This is a chirurgien dentiste, a title recently elevated by Napoleon's reforms to distinguish professionals from the hacks and back-alley tooth yankerers. France, in its ever-theatrical flair, decided to not only regulate dentistry but to dignify it. And somehow, no one's quite sure how, Verse got tangled up in the roots. He pulls up a tray of instruments that jingle like wind chimes in a horror film. A slender hook, a lever, a wicked-looking pair of extraction forceps, and beside them, a frilly notebook. You spot ink smudges and phrases in looping cursive, something about a molten river of ivory despair. Lovely. Before we begin, he says, brushing your cheek with a hand that's probably handled far too many exposed nerves today, let me share a short composition. A little something to calm the soul before we trouble the gums. Of course. He clears his throat and begins. Beneath the bone, where roots do cling, a quiet ache begins to sing. You're not sure whether to be moved or mildly insulted that he's making a dental abscess sound romantic. But this was the norm. With surgery being terrifying and painkillers still a bit of a gamble, many dentists turned to theatrics as a distraction. In France especially, the profession was trying desperately to distance itself from its crude origins, barbers who doubled as surgeons, yanking teeth between shaves and bleeding out headaches. To gain public trust, early 19th century dentists began emphasizing taste, both literally and socially. A polished vocabulary, a bit of Latin, some well-placed literary flair, these were all as necessary as any scalpel. And for the more ambitious practitioners, poetry offered the perfect tool to build a brand. Historians still argue whether this was a sincere cultural movement or an elaborate marketing scheme. Either way, the barber's chair was evolving. The blood-soaked rags and crude tomes were giving way to velvet headrests and sterilized brass. Pain remained, but pain was being reframed, beautified, given meter. Some dentists even published their work in literary journals, right next to proper authors. A few gained minor celebrity status. There's one documented case of a dentist in Lyon who performed an entire extraction recital, alternating between verses and valve pliers, with an audience applauding every stanza. Did the patient consent? Was she drugged? We may never know. One French anecdote tells of a dentist poet who insisted his apprentices memorize Petrarchan sonnets before learning how to disinfect an abscess. The theory? A refined tongue led to a gentler hand. The results? Mixed, at best. Back in your chair, you open your mouth, and the dentist peers inside with the satisfied air of a man reading a beloved novel. He hums. A third molar with curvature. Quite the stubborn chap. You know, this reminds me of my last ode. And then he recites again. He clung, that molar, brave and bold, to crimson caves, both warm and cold. You resist the urge to clench. There's something undeniably French about all this, the fusion of suffering and sophistication. Of course, not all patients were enchanted. One woman famously stormed out of a Paris clinic yelling, "Just pull the damn thing, not my heartstrings." Still, many stayed. Why? Maybe because amid the terrifying creaks and clicks of 19th century dentistry, the rhythm of a well-composed line gave structure to chaos. Maybe a poetic dentist just seemed more trustworthy. After all, anyone quoting Moliere couldn't possibly be reckless with your enamel, right? Historians still debate whether this poetic wave was truly widespread or more of a Parisian niche. Rural dentists mostly stuck to the boil and pray method, less verse, more vinegar. But in the capital, poetry and pliers went hand in hand. Your appointment ends with a curt nod. The dentist hands you a lace-edged card bearing not your bill, but a stanza in calligraphy. A gift, he calls it. You leave bleeding slightly, aching entirely, and yet, oddly flattered. Outside, the city moves on. A man hawks sugar-roasted almonds. A horse cart clatters past. And from a nearby second-floor window, you hear someone rhyming incisor with desire. Naturally. You're walking now, a little numb in the jaw, the echo of dental verse still ringing in your ears. It's not even noon, and already you've been serenaded by a stranger with a scalpel. Welcome to 19th century France, where tooth pain isn't just diagnosed, it's dramatized. As you duck into a nearby cafe for something soft, broth, maybe, or a pastry with less chewing resistance, you can't stop thinking about those strange little odes. The dentist's words were clumsy, yes, but oddly sincere. And as you glance at the back of the lace-edged receipt, you realize you're holding an original composition. A poem dedicated to your infected molar. You're part of the art now. Terrifying. You're not alone. Parisian dentists of this era wrote hundreds of poems, many of which were published in pamphlets, newspapers, or bound chapbooks that have survived in dusty corners of national archives. The themes range from the sublime to the deranged. There are love poems to bicuspids, epics about the horrors of gingivitis, and wistful reflections on childhood teeth lost to adolescence and poor hygiene. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of dental poetry was a grassroots movement or a top-down trend encouraged by academies desperate to humanize the profession. Either way, it was real, and sometimes, shockingly moving. You unfold another poem slipped to you by the dental assistant, more bard than nurse, and read. White pillars standing proud in rows, now dimmed by rotten sugar's throes. Who knew tooth decay could sound like the fall of Rome? French dentists, apparently. For them, teeth weren't just anatomy, they were emblems of mortality, status, and beauty. A chipped incisor could mean lost love. A pulled molar, social shame. Your mouth was a battlefield where nature, nurture, and nougat collided. And when those battles ended badly, as they often did, someone had to tell the tale. So they wrote. With quills and ink-stained fingertips, between appointments and abscess drainings, they composed. And oh, the imagery. Teeth became ivory tombstones, mouths velvet prisons, gums rosy arenas of civil war. You'd think they were describing the French Revolution, not a cleaning. One French piece of trivia? Some poets insisted on writing from the perspective of the teeth themselves. There's an actual poem, anonymous, of course, where a molar begs for mercy, denouncing its host for neglect. I cradled meats and whispered sweets. Yet you betrayed me with caramel treats. It's dramatic. It's bizarre. It's very French. You finish your soup with exaggerated caution and glance around. A man nearby is reading a thin little booklet labeled Poems Dentaires, Volume 2. You nod. He nods back. Silence suffers in a world where every cavity could be canonized. There was something genuinely vulnerable about it all. These weren't just professionals showing off. Many of them saw poetry as a way to process what they witnessed daily: pain, panic, failure. A patient screaming. A child losing their first tooth in tears. A woman begging them to save a rotting molar because she feared what her smile would say about her virtue. The emotional toll was immense, and in a century when therapy wasn't a thing and most physicians barely acknowledged mental health, writing it down became an outlet. And yes, sometimes it was performative. One dentist, Jacques-Félix Lemoyne, became famous for reading poems aloud while performing procedures. Patients were more distracted, he claimed. Less likely to faint, more likely to pay for the deluxe extraction package. He once hosted a public reading titled On the Elegance of the Incisor in Decline. Packed house. But not everyone appreciated the trend. Some critics derided dental poetry as grotesque, a tacky gimmick masking incompetence. Rhyming cannot clean the root, one sour columnist snapped in Le Figaro. Still, the movement endured. Why? Because it wasn't just dentists. Patients started getting in on the action, too. Letters to the editor poured in with haikus about dental visits gone wrong, limericks about missing dentures, and florid love poems praising straight teeth and minty breath. It became something of a social ritual. Get a cleaning, write a verse. As you walk back into the street, feeling marginally restored, you pass a bookstore window. In the display, sonnets for the soul and the socket. You think about going in, but your mouth throbs in protest. Maybe later. Still, it's hard not to be charmed. In a time before antibiotics, electric drills, or numbing gels, the French chose metaphor as medicine. They faced the agony of abscesses with waxed mustaches, feathered pens, and a tragic sense of humor. And whether it worked or not, you can't deny, it's more memorable than mouthwash. You're strolling now through the Marais, winding your way past ivy-covered facades and shuttered wine cellars, when the sound of clapping makes you pause. A small crowd gathers outside a modest performance hall tucked between a print shop and an apothecary. The poster reads, Ce soir, dentist dramaturges, theatre dentaire et poésie sur scène. You squint. Tonight's performance? The Bicuspids of Versailles. Of course. You slip inside, more out of morbid curiosity than expectation, and find yourself in a velvet-trimmed room where the stage is half-lit and smells faintly of cloves and chalk dust. On it, Two men in waistcoats act out a scene where one plays a suffering noble and the other, his personal dentist. There is moaning, there is gauze, and, naturally, there is verse. Alas, cries the noble, holding his jaw. No word did hurt me so as thou, O left molar of misery. Cue dramatic swoon. The audience erupts in applause. You blink. Is this a fever dream? No, it's just a Tuesday in 1840s Paris. You're watching a curious phenomenon unfold, a side hustle that took root among many dentists with theatrical leanings. Long before the notion of work-life balance, French dentists decided that the best way to bridge their professional and personal passions was to literally combine them. So they wrote plays about dentistry, often starring themselves, and performed them in small community theaters or salon gatherings. Yes, you're sitting in a room full of Parisians laughing at a joke about impacted wisdom teeth. Historians still argue whether this practice was ever truly widespread or just a niche quirk of the urban elite, but what's certain is this: some dentists considered themselves artists above all. They weren't merely pulling teeth, they were pulling at the fabric of human drama, one throbbing molar at a time. And audiences came. Maybe for the novelty. Maybe because public readings and dramatizations offered a chance to see these strange men in a different light, not as fearsome surgeons, but as vulnerable, almost comical figures. The stage made them less intimidating. A dentist who can mock his own forceps in a punchline seems a little less likely to botch your extraction. You glance at the playbill. Act 2 involves a dream sequence in which a sentient molar accuses the dentist of betrayal. It ends in a duel, with toothbrushes. The playwright? A man who owns a reputable clinic on the left bank. By day, he performs root canals. By night, he performs metered monologues about oral hygiene. Paris, baby. One fringe story tells of a dentist who wrote an entire comedic operetta called Plaque and Prejudice, a romantic farce set in a fictional dental academy. It was banned after one too many suggestive metaphors involving drills. And while some critics found these works absurd, others praised them as cathartic. After all, toothache was nearly universal. Audiences related. They knew the dread of that dull, creeping pain in the jaw. They laughed, they winced, and for a few hours, they felt less alone in their suffering. One performance review in La Gazette Medical famously opened with, "I came for the dental satire, but I stayed for the unexpectedly moving elegy to an upper right canine." Hard to argue with that. You settle into your seat, surrounded by elegantly dressed Parisians murmuring critiques like, "His meter is weak, but that bicuspid metaphor? Sublime." During intermission, the lobby offers mint lozenges and wine. The chatter is half literary analysis, half complaints about inflamed gums. You're reminded that in this city, every profession has its moment of theater. The dentist is no exception. He steps on stage, floss in one hand, feelings in the other. His patient moans, his tools gleam, and someone in the front row dabs their eyes with a silk kerchief. You stay through the final act. It ends with a choral ode to fluoride, anachronistic, yes, but beautifully sung. The audience rises for a standing ovation. Outside, night has fallen. The gas lamps buzz like insects. You hear two older women debating the symbolism of a decaying wisdom tooth in Act 3. You nod as you pass. Somehow, it all makes sense. Back in the 21st century, you might joke about theater kids becoming dentists if their acting careers don't pan out. But here in 19th century France, the two identities coexist, and they do so with panache. You've barely digested last night's molar-themed melodrama when you find yourself back in another dental waiting room, and this one is something else entirely. Velvet drapes, oil paintings of vaguely unsettling smiles, and, yes, pamphlets. Dozens of them. You grab a stack, curious. The titles range from the promising, Preventing Gum Catastrophes in 6 Steps, to the utterly baffling, The Bleeding Rose, a sonnet on tartar. This isn't your usual pile of outdated magazines. These are printed poetic guides to dental hygiene, composed by the varied professionals you're waiting to see. Some are rhymed with near-militant discipline. Others freewheel into chaotic stanzas about mouthwash and self-worth. One opens with, "Scrub not in haste, ye mortal fool, for a reckless brush becomes cruel tool." Well then, in 19th century France, this sort of thing was not only normal, it was expected in higher-end practices. Dental waiting rooms were curated spaces for education, branding, and aesthetic refinement. And nothing said we cared deeply about your bicuspids like a laminated ode to the tongue scraper. Historians still argue whether these poetic pamphlets had actual clinical value or were just a sophisticated way to kill time. But some of them offered surprisingly sound advice. Brush gently, avoid sugar, chew parsley if breath be foul. One rhyming guide titled To the Blushing Bride with Aching Jaw even included a recipe for clove oil rinse between two shockingly flirty quatrains. The writing was all over the place. Some dentists emulated Racine's classical tone, referencing ancient Greek humoral theory with alarming sincerity. Others were more theatrical, think operatic metaphors, tragic decay, and enamel compared to snow-covered battlements. And then there were the erotic ones. Yes, erotic dental poetry. You're sitting there, halfway through a pamphlet innocently titled The Lover's Smile, when you realize you're reading a very detailed allegory involving a tongue, a cavity, and the phrase flooded with longing. You glance around to see if anyone noticed your raised eyebrows. An older woman 2 chairs down fans herself. She's reading the same thing. You now understand why these waiting rooms were never short on readers. French society at the time was obsessed with duality, body and soul, pleasure and pain, civility and instinct. Teeth, hidden yet exposed, symbols of beauty yet sites of decay, fit perfectly into that philosophical groove. No wonder they inspired such mixed metaphors. You flip through another, Elegy for a Premolar, a tear-streaked tribute to a tooth lost too soon due to the sweet cruelty of candied violets. Another is written entirely in haiku form. Mint leaf on my tongue. Still the ache of root remains. Brush. Spit. Pray. Repeat. Catchy. And kind of bleak. A fringe trend during this period? Competitive pamphleteering. Yes, dentists would write poems targeting each other's hygiene advice. One surgeon-dentist in Bordeaux famously published Against the Tongue Brute, attacking his rival's claim that vigorous brushing builds character. The rival replied, in verse, with the gentle bristles defense. 2 men, 1 city, and way too many stanzas about toothbrush stiffness. You finally look up. The room is still full of people lost in pamphlets. Some giggle. Some grimace. One man furiously scribbles notes, perhaps inspired to pen his own plaque in circumstance. And then there's the assistant, moving through the room in soft shoes, handing out tea in delicate porcelain cups and offering more pamphlets to those who've finished. She stops by your chair, offers a smile, and says, "Would you prefer satire or romance?" Only in Paris would dental genres be a thing. You pick satire. She hands you a folded sheet titled "O Gluttony, Thou Art a Canker." You're already in love with it. At the center of all this is the idea that education didn't have to be dry. Dentists knew that lectures about bacteria wouldn't stick, but a memorable rhyme about oral disaster and cinnamon tarts? That stayed with you. Historians still debate the long-term impact of these poetic brochures. Did they actually reduce decay rates among the bourgeoisie? Or were they just charming relics of an age when people had more time to read about their gingivae? You suspect both might be true. Your name is called. Time to see the poet practitioner in the next room. But you tuck one pamphlet into your coat pocket. A love letter to the lower left 6. Something about it feels personal. You lie back in the examination chair, which squeaks under you like it's got secrets. The dentist, tall and perfumed like a courtier, greets you with an oddly conspiratorial grin. "Ah," he says, "a reader of my latest." You have the look of someone who appreciates metaphor. You mumble a polite response. He chuckles and adjusts the gas lamp overhead. "Let me guess. Oh, gluttony, thou art a canker." He winks. That piece gets more fan mail than my extractions. Then he lowers the chair until you're horizontal and entirely vulnerable. Perfect position for a philosophy lecture. "Do you know," he says while poking at your gums with what looks like a tiny meat hook, "that sugar is the true villain of the modern age?" He doesn't wait for an answer. Our teeth rot because our passions rot. It's all connected. He leans in closer. In the Ancien Regime, there was restraint. But now? Pastries. Carnivals. Lovers who taste like cherry cordial and cheap secrets. You try to nod but forget about the hook. He continues, "I wrote a poem about it. Would you like to hear it?" You absolutely would not. But this is France, and you are not in charge here. She smiled with lips of raspberry jam, but her breath told tales of moral sham. And just like that, you're plunged into an entire genre of dental poetry, the sensual decay. French dentists of the 19th century weren't just preaching about floss, they were moralizing through molars. They saw a connection between indulgence, sensuality, and dental catastrophe. Historians still argue whether these verses were sincere moral warnings or tongue-in-cheek satire dressed in lace. You learn quickly that female sugar consumption was a favorite scapegoat. Dentists, and sometimes their poet patients, composed cautionary tales disguised as romantic lamentations. A single bonbon could doom a tooth and, metaphorically, an entire romance. Her laugh was lilac, one poem goes, until nougat claimed her smile. Brutal. But it wasn't just sugar. It was what sugar represented: indulgence, excess, modernity, and femininity itself. One particularly dramatic pamphlet described the candied descent of virtue as a process beginning with soft gums and ending with loose morals. You could almost hear the mustache twirling behind that quill. Of course, women wrote back. Some early female dentists and poets, rare but fierce, reclaimed the sugary imagery. One witty response opened with, "Yes, I kissed him after jam, and still my molars nobly stand." That pamphlet caused a stir in several Parisian salons and may have gotten the author uninvited from at least one dental society soiree. Still, the stereotype stuck. Sugar became the poetic shorthand for risk, ruin, and, paradoxically, romantic allure. After all, what's more seductive than danger wrapped in foil? You lie helplessly as your dentist pauses to swish brandy in a tiny cup, just for inspiration, you assume, and then pulls out a wax model of a decayed molar. "This," he says with reverence, "was once the pride of a duchess. She recited Sappho while I cleaned her enamel. But alas, caramels." He gazes mournfully at the model before placing it gently back on a silk cushion, as if tucking in a child. A fringe rumor circulates among patients that some dentists actually use bits of love letters as stuffing in tooth molds. No one can prove it, but the image persists, a literal fusion of heartbreak and root canal. Your dentist, for his part, keeps quoting Ovid as he files at something sharp and surprisingly hot. "Pain is the gateway to beauty," he muses. "And teeth are the threshold. By now your mouth feels like a furnace." But he's nearly done. Just one final stanza to distract you while he flosses something you didn't even know you had. "In sweetness born, in shadow spoiled. My bite, betrayed by cream and coil." He wipes your chin like a proud father after a piano recital. "Très bien. Now rinse." You stumble upright, dizzy from gas, poetry, and peppermint rinse. He hands you a folded card. On it, a warning, in rhyme. "Beware the fruit, the tart, the truffle. Not all delights are worth the scuffle." You're not sure if that's dietary advice or a dating tip. Either way, you thank him, tip your hat, and exit into the street, where the smell of pastries hits you immediately. A child bites into a croissant. Somewhere, a poet-dentist sighs. You wander through the Rue Saint-Honoré, a little dazed, half from the fumes of clove oil and half from trying to process whether that poem about truffles was meant to make you feel guilty for enjoying life. Ahead of you, a bookstall glints in the morning sun, rows of second-hand volumes stacked like mini cathedrals. You thumb past treatises on gout, manuals on palmistry, and then, there it is, Les Dents et l'honneur, vers sur la mâchoire virile. A full volume of dental poetry. About masculinity. You buy it for the price of a stale tart, and as you flip it open, you realize you've stumbled into a whole new territory, poems where teeth become metaphors for power, virility, strength, and social dominance. There's a lot of jaw-clenching. A suspicious amount, actually. To grind, to bite, to clench with pride. No man is brave with jaws denied. Right. Historians still argue whether these chest-thumping odes to dental dominance were a response to broader anxieties of the time, changing gender roles, rising middle-class fragility, or perhaps just too many soft cheeses dulling the bite of Frenchmen. Whatever the cause, French dentists in the 1800s had clearly decided that molars were macho. The idea was this: a strong jaw equals a strong man. Good teeth reflected not only good breeding but discipline. To have a full set of pearly whites was to possess control over your appetites, carnal, culinary, and conversational. And losing teeth? That was more than physical, it was symbolic. It meant weakness, decay, a slip in moral fiber. You pass a tailor's window and spot a dandy with gleaming canines grinning back in a lithograph. His quote reads, "What need have I for sword or pistol? My smile disarms and dismembers." Subtle. This link between dental structure and social stature was reinforced everywhere, from poetry to portraits to etiquette manuals. One pamphlet, Le Dentifrice de l'Homme Fort, promised its readers breath that commands armies and enamel that shines like a general's epaulet. You roll your eyes, but it's fascinating. The poets weren't just describing teeth, they were narrating identity. A chipped incisor might be the result of a drunken brawl, a duel, or even a failed proposal. And rather than feel shame, many men wore their dental scars like medals. One fringe fad among young officers, having gold or silver crowns etched with initials or Latin phrases. Veni, vidi, mendicavi, I came, I saw, I chewed. The poetry reflected this rugged aesthetic. Verses referenced battle, conquest, and the taming of both women and wild boars. One sonnet cycles between describing a saber duel and the loss of a molar with the same reverence. There are entire stanzas dedicated to biting through bread crusts like it's a mark of national identity. You turn the page. The crust did crack, the jaw did strain. But what is man if not his pain? My molar snapped, a noble cause. For bread unbroken leaves us loss. Dramatic? Absolutely. But also, in its own bizarre way, beautiful. Some scholars believe these hypermasculine dental poems were a pushback against the rising tide of medicalization. As dentistry became more clinical and less artisanal, some older practitioners saw poetry as a way to romanticize their roots, when pulling a tooth meant proving one's manhood, not submitting to antiseptic silence. One infamous dentist, Dr. Moreau de la Joe, hosted evenings of molar masculinity, where men gathered to drink port, compare bite strengths, measured by breaking walnuts, and share verses. You can almost hear the monocles clanking. And while most of these poems never made it beyond self-published vanity projects or pamphlets traded in salons, they served their purpose. They gave voice to a time when men were figuring out how to remain relevant, gracefully, or otherwise, in a world where even their mouths were becoming regulated, cataloged, and judged. You close the book as you reach a cafe. The waiter grins, one gold tooth, intentionally exposed. You order soup. No chewing today. As you sip, you wonder what modern masculinity would look like in dental verse. Probably a TikTok filter and a whitening kit. But back here in 1840s Paris, a real man bleeds from the gums and writes a sonnet about it. You're seated now at a smoky little salon on the right bank, nursing a cup of anise tea and trying to wrap your sore jaw and brain around the idea that teeth once stirred more literary debate than entire political treaties. A woman to your left is declaiming a poem about molars in mourning. To your right, two men argue whether Rousselet's 1838 theory on molar symmetry applies metaphorically to emotional equilibrium. You, meanwhile, just want to avoid another rhymed ode about tartar. And yet, you lean in. The conversation shifts toward ethics. Not ethics as in should I floss, but ethics as in is it morally acceptable to pull a child's teeth for coin? One man gestures wildly with his quill, declaring, deciduous teeth are capitalist pawns. Someone else counters, they are symbols of ephemeral beauty, reminders of youth's betrayal. This is a Wednesday night in 1846. Welcome to Salon Dentaire. These salons weren't just social gatherings. They were battlegrounds for ideas where science, art, and amateur philosophy chewed on each other like molars grinding through meat. And dental poetry was the perfect in-between. Not quite medicine, not quite literature, it gave participants an excuse to moralize over mousse. You sip your tea and observe the room. One man reads aloud. She sold her first for sugar bread. The second went to keep them fed. By 10, her jaw was lined in gold. A smile bought cheap, a childhood sold. It gets quiet. Someone murmurs tragic. Another nods. And you realize, beneath the laze and laughter, there's real pain here. In the 19th century, selling children's teeth wasn't unheard of. Street traders, particularly in poorer districts, purchased milk teeth to be used in prosthetics for the wealthy. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't hygienic. But it was profitable. And French poets, true to their melodramatic instincts, couldn't ignore it. Historians still argue whether tooth trade verses were sincere protests or moral theater, a way to feel outraged without actually confronting the people doing the selling. But either way, it created a literary subgenre, the exploited incisor elegy. These poems often framed baby teeth as fallen heroes, their innocent ivories sold off to prop up the dentures of the old and vain. Some were touching. Others veered into the grotesque. One satirical piece titled The Tooth Merchant's Wife describes a woman making stew from canines steeped in clove and shame. It's not subtle. And yet, here in the salons, it's treated as valid critique. people debate these works. Do the teeth symbolize the commodification of youth? The erosion of family bonds? Or is it all just an elaborate excuse for men to weep publicly while reciting sonnets? Even dental ethics got poetic. Should a dentist compose a verse before pulling a tooth? Is it exploitative to make art from patient pain? Should especially poetic extractions cost more? One dentist tried this. It did not go well. One fringe discussion from a salon diary describes a fierce argument over whether rhyming about halitosis was vulgar or brave. The winning argument claimed it was a reclamation of bodily truth. The losing side sulked and wrote a limerick in protest. You smile weakly, careful not to strain the healing socket in your cheek. Across the room, a woman is passing around a bound volume titled Enamel and Empathy. Inside are poems written from the perspective of extracted teeth who miss their hosts and long to be reinserted, not for function, but for love. He brushed me once, then tossed me out. Now I lie here, a ghost of doubt. A young man sighs. It's haunting, he says. So much better than her gingivitis cycle. The salon quiets as someone calls for a reading of Gums of the Republic, a controversial piece that links oral decay to political corruption. As the molars rot, so too the throne. It begins. People applaud before it even finishes. You sit back, feeling the swirl of mint and melancholy settle in your chest. Somehow, in this room filled with velvet and vinegar breath, you're starting to understand. The mouth isn't just a medical site, it's symbolic. And for these poets, every plaque build-up is a moral lesson waiting to be unraveled in metaphor. As you leave the salon, the host hands you a parting gift, a slip of verse printed on fine linen paper. Speak not in prose of root and pain, for only rhyme can make us sane. You fold it gently and tuck it into your pocket. It feels heavier than it should. The next morning, you're in a lecture hall, not as a student, not exactly, but not entirely as a tourist either. The place smells like boiled wool and dental putty, and you're seated on a worn wooden bench behind three very serious young men clutching quills and blotting paper. Before you stands a professor in a stiff collar and dusty frock coat, gesturing toward a diagram of a molar projected via an overhead lantern magique. But here's the twist, the blackboard behind him is also filled with verse. Not anatomy. Not Latin. Verse. You're in the Académie Dentaire de Paris, circa 1851. And yes, they're grading on rhyme schemes. It turns out, dentistry students in certain French schools, particularly the more elite or fashionably liberal ones, were sometimes encouraged to supplement their medical studies with poetic assignments. Not as fluff, mind you, but as a way of cultivating bedside manner, clarity of thought, and, bizarrely, aesthetic discipline. As one curriculum handbook phrased it, a man who cannot compose a stanza will often also fail to align a jaw. Historians still argue whether this was ever officially endorsed by the dental guilds or just an eccentric trend practiced by a few flamboyant professors. But the anecdotal evidence is everywhere, collections of graded student verses, yearbooks featuring Best Dental Ode, and even duels fought over accusations of plagiarism in meter. You glance at the student notes beside you. One reads, "The cusp, a peak, so pale and proud. Beneath it nerves do throb aloud. Solid iambic tetrameter." You give the student a respectful nod. He looks smug. At the front of the class, the professor claps his hands. "Gentlemen, today we discuss inflammation, but lyrically, who can offer an image of gingivitis that moves the soul?" A hand shoots up. Red tides upon the coral reef of breath. Applause. The professor smiles. "Bravo. Now someone rhyme puss with elegance." You're amazed, and honestly a little horrified. These students are not only memorizing dental charts but are expected to express them in flowery language. You flip through one abandoned notebook and find a full sonnet titled Upon Extracting Madame Lefebvre's Lower Right 7. It includes the phrase oozing nobility. Unforgettable. And it wasn't just for fun. Professors believed poetic training could cultivate a more attentive, more humane dentist. Writing verse required listening, to rhythm, to nuance. If you could do that with language, the theory went, you might actually listen to your patients, too. One fringe lecture note recounts an exercise where students had to compare different types of pain, sharp, dull, throbbing, in metaphor only. "Never say ache," the professor had scrawled. "Say the dull throb of remorse in Ivory's crypt, sure. Why not?" You begin to realize these young men weren't being trained to fix mouths. They were being trained to understand them, symbolically, even spiritually. Enamel was honor. plaque was corruption. A good cleaning was not unlike confession. The student beside you leans over and whispers, "Do you want to hear my sestina about molar rotation?" You lie and say you have a weak stomach. Still, some of these aspiring poets were no slouches. Several went on to publish books of verse, some under pseudonyms, others proudly attaching their medical credentials to each poem. A few even became dual celebrities, one for his groundbreaking work in abscess drainage, and the other for his tragic epic The Crown That Shattered. Outside the lecture hall, you find a bulletin board covered in announcements for upcoming poetry contests, ode to an impacted third molar, elegy for the edentulous. One flyer offers a cash prize for whoever can best describe the sound of dental scraping in heroic couplets. You stroll through the courtyard, where students read aloud to each other beneath leafing chestnut trees. A young man is weeping softly beside a bust of Paracelsus, whether from dental pain or poetic disappointment, it's hard to say. And despite yourself, you start thinking, maybe there was something to this. Maybe forcing dentists to see the beauty, the tragedy, the symbolism in a set of teeth made them better at caring for them. Or at least, made the pain feel more dignified. You pass a wall of student portraits. Beneath each face, a verse they'd submitted for graduation. You pause at one. She came for care, she left with grief. Her smile stolen, yet a thief. Chilling. And weirdly beautiful. You're reclined again, though this time by choice, at a clinic that promises pain-free extraction accompanied by poetic distraction. You didn't believe it either, until the assistant offered you a lavender-scented kerchief and a handwritten menu of poetic forms. Shall we accompany your procedure with a limerick, a villanelle, or perhaps a free verse meditation on bicuspid fragility? You pick limerick. You're not proud of that. Moments later, you're floating somewhere just above your eyebrows, thanks to a generous dose of nitrous oxide. The world goes misty. Your limbs feel made of boiled pasta. And beside you, your dentist poet, an auburn-haired man with tortoiseshell spectacles, recites. There once was a tooth quite decayed, who in fear of the forceps, delayed. But with verse and with gas, it departed with class. And the patient? Most handsomely paid. You giggle. Not because it's clever, though it is, but because everything seems hilarious now. Including the fact that your jaw is currently wide open and home to several pieces of gleaming equipment that would have terrified your ancestors. The gas, or laughing gas as it's been cheekily marketed since its introduction in France during the mid-1800s, wasn't just a medical breakthrough, it was a poetic one. For dentists who dabbled in verse, nitrous oxide offered a dreamy bridge between the real and the lyrical. It dulled the pain, yes, but it also created a dissociative state that made patients unusually receptive to recitations, or so these poetic practitioners claimed. Historians still argue whether the combination of gas and poetry had any real benefit, or if it was simply the 19th century version of a placebo cocktail. Still, anecdotal evidence points to many patients reporting less fear, lower pain perception, and even pleasant hallucinations involving rhymed dialogue between teeth. One fringe tale, often whispered among students, involves a patient who, under the influence of ether and heavy poetic bombardment, fell in love with her own extracted molar. She later commissioned a necklace to encase it, inscribed with a line from the poem recited during its removal, though gone from the gum, still dear to my heart. You, too, are floating. The world sways in time with the rhythm of the stanza being sung softly by the assistant, who seems to be improvising. The root ran deep, like ancient sin, but out it came, with silver grin. Your eyes flutter. It's weirdly soothing. Of course, not all dentists were on board. More conservative practitioners viewed the use of gas, especially combined with poetry, as undignified. They scoffed at what they called ether theatrics. One Parisian dentist even wrote a bitter haiku. Verse and vapor lie. Real teeth need force, not couplets. Stop singing. Pull hard. He was not invited to many salon evenings. Still, the practice gained traction. Some dentists began advertising not only their technical skills, but the style of verse they offered. Ads in Le Figaro boasted sauna-sterilized spaces and haiku for halitosis. One famous clinic even separated rooms by genre, epic poetry for extractions, romantic verse for cleanings, and experimental meter for root canals. You, currently mid-extraction, are lulled by a rhymed description of your own gums. So pink, so pure, so wetly bright. A battlefield in morning light. You have no idea if it's working, but you're not screaming, and that's something. The procedure ends with a slow hiss of the gas valve. Reality tiptoes back. Your dentist gently pats your shoulder and hands you a post-op guide, written, of course, in dactylic hexameter. You smile, one tooth short, but undeniably charmed. As you walk out into the street, the air tastes sharper. You feel oddly renewed. Your jaw aches, sure, but your brain hums with rhyme. There's something to be said for facing trauma with poetry. Something very human. You pause by a bakery. The pastries gleam like forbidden fruit. You decline. Not today, sweet temptress. Not after what that limerick just did for your self-awareness. And from somewhere deep in your mouth, where the molar once lived, you almost hear a whisper of farewell. Gone, not forgotten, from this shrine of spit. Farewell to the cusp, the grind, the grit. You find yourself in a quieter arrondissement now, one of those gently sloping neighborhoods where the gaslights flicker in time with your heartbeat. The toothache is gone. Or maybe it's just hiding under the poetry. Either way, you're calm enough to follow a soft trail of violin music into a low-slung cafe lit entirely by beeswax and pretension. Inside, it's smoky, hushed, reverent. And right in the middle of it all, a man in a velvet coat standing on a footstool, weeping as he reads from a poem titled Ode to the Aching Heart, and gums. You've wandered straight into a romantic poetry gathering, where the literary elite come not just to mourn lost love, but to fold it neatly into dental metaphors. It shouldn't surprise you anymore. In 19th century France, where everything from war to weather got romanticized, tooth pain was a perfect metaphor for longing. You take a seat near the back, between a student with bleeding gums and a duchess dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed lace square. The poem continues. Her words were sweet, her breath divine. Yet abscess grew twixt every line. You flinch slightly, but no one else does. These people take this very seriously. Romantic poets of the era were obsessed with the body, especially its betrayal. A beautiful smile masking rot beneath? A perfect metaphor for doomed affection. And dental discomfort, slow, constant, quietly unbearable, was ideal poetic material. A toothache doesn't scream, it murmurs ruin. It's the perfect stand-in for a love that's gone sour, but won't quite let go. Historians still argue whether the overlap between dental suffering and romantic symbolism was conscious or simply inevitable in a culture steeped in both melodrama and molasses. But the resulting poems endure. You listen as another poet takes the floor, this one quieter, a bit more trembly. Her poem is called When He Stopped Brushing. It begins simply. He stopped with the floss, then stopped with the calls. My roots exposed through heartbreak's thralls. Someone sighs audibly. The woman next to you blows her nose and whispers, he must have been a Capricorn. This is not a parody. These people mean it. Of course, the Romantic period didn't invent symbolic pain, but it did elevate it. And in a city where salon culture dominated intellectual life, the line between genuine grief and performative despair blurred gloriously. Tooth pain, unavoidable, humbling, offered the perfect physical echo for inner anguish. And as literacy rates rose and printing became cheaper, even the middle class started publishing their own little tragedies. Dentists began keeping scrapbooks. One fringe trend? Breakup cleanings. Yes, people, mostly women, though not exclusively, scheduled appointments immediately after romantic dissolutions. They'd come in, crying, and leave with polished teeth and a personalized verse from the dentist. One woman kept all of hers in a locket. You open a small booklet on the table beside you. It's hand-stitched, bound in pressed linen, and titled Enameled Regrets. Inside, you smiled through pain and hid decay. But your tongue knew all the way. Yikes. Still, something about the transparency of it all feels oddly comforting. They weren't afraid to sound ridiculous. They weren't trying to be subtle. A molar could symbolize betrayal. A cavity could represent neglect. Gums could recite truths that lips never dared utter. One poet even built an entire collection around the metaphor of tooth grinding during sleep, a collection called Night Cracks. Critics hated it. Lovers of melodrama ate it up like it was licorice and revenge. As you sip a bitter black coffee, the host passes around a verse box, encouraging everyone to drop in a line on the theme loss and floss. You scribble one down. You won't admit it, but you enjoyed that. Before you leave, a young man reads a closing piece. It's long, winding, and a bit overdone, but his final lines catch you off guard. When lips are gone and breath is past, our teeth still tell the truths we masked. Silence follows. Then polite clapping. You slip out into the night. The cobblestones gleam wet underfoot. Somewhere, bells toll a late hour. And though your mouth is healing, something deeper tugs, a strange ache for a time when people turned even their pain into poetry, when root canals ended in rhyme. You smile. Just a little crooked. Just human enough. The next morning, with your jaws slightly stiff but your soul oddly lifted, you find yourself in a narrow hallway inside a small, private dental museum near the Latin Quarter. It's unmarked on most maps, only a tiny brass plate beside the door, Cabinet de Curiosités Dentaires. The woman at the front desk doesn't speak. She simply hands you a wax-sealed pass and gestures toward a velvet curtain. Inside, it's dead silent. Cool. Dusty. Dimly lit by oil lamps shaped like molars. And what greets you first is not a collection of dental instruments, but a wall of glass cases, each holding a single, carefully labeled extracted tooth. Below each, a date, a name, and, of course, a poem. Welcome to La Galerie de Dents Perdus. You step closer. One case holds a tiny incisor. Beneath it, on an ivory plaque, it reads, Marie Delacourt, age 14, April 12, 1852. I left my smile at the convent door. They took the tooth, but not the war. You blink. Beneath the next, Hervé Lemoyne, age 71, March 6, 1849. This crown I wore in soup and psalm. Too short the time it stood so strong. Each one is like a memorial, part anatomy, part art installation. This isn't dentistry. It's devotion. A museum not of tools or technique, but of stories told through the things we leave behind when pain finally wins. Historians still argue whether this gallery began as a clinical archive or as a private collection by a particularly sentimental dentist with a flair for verse. Some speculate it started as a teaching tool, others as a secret indulgence, an emotional ledger of patients who impacted him. What's certain is that by the 1850s, it had grown into an unofficial shrine for the poetic side of the profession. You walk slowly. Some teeth are perfectly white, barely used. Others are cracked, dark, jagged like little fossils. The poems range from clumsy to exquisite. One limerick mourns the loss of a premolar to a date night nougat. Another sonnet thanks a bicuspid for its years of faithful chewing. And just when you think you've seen the most peculiar one, you stop short at a molar encased in leaded crystal. The poem underneath is handwritten in fading ink. You held me back from one more lie. Bit my tongue when tears ran dry. My bitter friend, my buried spy. I leave you now. I don't ask why. It's unsigned. You stare at it longer than you mean to. The air feels heavier here. A fringe rumor you once heard in a salon surfaces again, that some of these teeth came not from the living, but the dead. That after the 1848 uprisings, dentists collected molars from fallen revolutionaries and immortalized them in verse as an act of mourning, or perhaps defiance. No one's ever confirmed it. But the idea that teeth, even in silence, could whisper rebellion, it stays with you. In the next room, things take a turn toward the theatrical. There's a glass coffin of sorts. Inside, an articulated wax jaw model, its teeth replaced with tiny scrolls. Each scroll holds a couplet. You press a button and the jaw animates, reciting in a metallic, too-polished voice. A smile is short, a wound is deep. The molar sings when none can sleep. Charming. And deeply unsettling. At the back of the museum, there's a guest book. People leave their own dental tales, scribbled in poetry, confession, or both. One reads, I feared the chair until I wept, but now my tongue in silence kept. Misses the gap where once it slept. You don't add your own entry. Not yet, but you take one last look at the gallery. The teeth gleam faintly in the lamplight, tiny monuments to grief, love, laughter, and decay. Each one plucked from pain and polished into poetry. As you leave, the receptionist hands you a bookmark. On it, a single line. When words rot, the teeth remain. You slip it into your coat pocket, next to the pamphlet from the waiting room and the love letter to your extracted molar. Your collection grows. Outside, the sun is blinding. Life bustles on. You hear someone biting into an apple, crisp and loud. You wince in sympathetic memory. But secretly, you kind of miss the poetry already. You're back in the city now, winding through the left bank's quieter streets, where things feel a bit more rebellious. Gone are the barbers with soft hands and embroidered verses. Here, The air tastes like ink and vinegar, and posters hang slightly crooked in shop windows, advertising everything from suffragette lectures to impromptu seances. And in the corner of one window, barely noticed, consultations by Madame Lavalier, dentiste DT poetess. Now we're talking. You push the door open and are greeted by the clatter of a dropped spoon and a heady perfume that smells like rosemary and old paper. The walls are lined with framed poetry, most of it signed ML. There are no male assistants, no velvet settees. Just a firm wooden chair, shelves of tinctures, and a steel tray that makes zero effort to hide its sharp edges. And then she appears. Madame Lavalier. Her coat is plain, her posture perfect. She greets you with a nod and a single question. Verse or silence? You say verse, naturally. Female dentists in 19th century France were rare, very rare. In fact, officially, women weren't admitted to many dental academies until the very late 1800s. But that didn't stop women like Madame Lavalier from practicing anyway, either as apprentices to male relatives, clandestine practitioners in progressive salons, or entirely self-taught. And the poetry? That was their armor. Historians still argue whether these women turned to poetry because it was the only acceptable form of intellectual self-expression, or whether it was simply the best weapon they had. Either way, it worked. Madame Lavalier's reputation as both a gentle extractor and a cutting poet earned her clientele from every rung of society, particularly women tired of being scolded for sweet habits they'd inherited, not chosen. She fits a steel mirror to your mouth and examines your gums with cool detachment. You grind, she mutters, probably from clenching your tongue too often. Then she smiles, a flash of irony. I wrote something about that. He said my breath was much too bold. So I bit back, now he's too teeth cold. You try not to laugh with your mouth open. Madame Lavalier wasn't the only one. A growing number of women, educated, rebellious, and quite done with patriarchal metaphors, began carving out a space in the dental poetic scene. Some did it anonymously, others loudly. They wrote poems that reframed decay as resistance, that turned plaque into patriarchy, that linked bleeding gums with the monthly ache of bodies misunderstood. One French journal from the period, La Molaire Moderne, only ever published 4 issues, but every piece inside was written by a female practitioner or patient. Titles included On the Moral Rot of Mouthwash Advice and This Jaw is Mine. Unsurprisingly, it was banned within 6 months. Back in the chair, Madame Lavalier is working with swift, deft motions. No dramatic recitations, no gas-induced reveries, just a steady stream of rhymed couplets muttered like spells. Hold still, don't flinch, don't run, don't speak. A woman works with hands, not cheek. You feel oddly safe. After the procedure, mercifully mild, a minor polish and the swift flick of a pick, she sits you upright and hands you a cup of strong herbal rinse. Swish. Think. Then spit. On the windowsill beside you are her collected works, Gingiva Guerriere, The Root Beneath, and the iconic Bleed, but briefly. Each book is slim, hand-bound, and laced with fury disguised as meter. You flip one open and find this gem. They asked if I could file and fill, but not if I had rhyme or will. So now I scrape, and now I write. And none protest when jaws bite tight. It's different from the dreamy romanticism you've been hearing. This is not metaphorical sorrow. This is tooth and nail feminism. You ask her if the poems are all hers. She snorts. No. There are others. Many others. But they're quiet, and mostly ignored, until someone's in pain. She doesn't need a salon. Her chair is the salon. And her poetry isn't designed to lull, it's meant to warn. This, too, is power. As you prepare to leave, she hands you a pamphlet, no flowers on the cover. Just block letters, smile, but with teeth. Inside, 10 terse verses, one for each type of molar. You thank her. She shrugs. If it hurts, write something. If it doesn't, write better. The street outside feels sharper now. A little less charming, a little more alive. And in your coat pocket, alongside sentimental laments and Baroque metaphors, you now carry something new. Something with edges. The next evening, you're back on the left bank, because of course you are, and you're stepping through the ornate doorway of a candlelit salon where the guest of honor is not a duke, or a general, or even a poet in the traditional sense. It's a dentist, and he's about to read an epic poem about a doomed love affair between, wait for it, an incisor and a gold crown. You're here for La Muse Molaire, the monthly literary gathering hosted in one of Paris's more decadent private residences. Crystal chandeliers dangle overhead. The walls are paneled in dark oak, with etchings of mouths mid-scream hung in neat, terrifying rows. A buffet table offers brandy pears, wine, and soft cheeses, intentionally soft, you suspect, for this particular crowd. The guests are murmuring already. Not about the canapes, but about the headliner, Dr. Sylvain Corbin, who's gained a cult following for what some call odontological operatics. He wears gloves even when not performing. No one knows why. Tonight, he takes the stage with a small bundle of parchment and a dramatic sigh. His poem is titled Les Dents du Cœur, or The Teeth of the Heart. And then he begins. Oh cruel day when ivory turned gold. She gleamed too bright, too bought, too cold. You stare. This isn't satire. He's serious. The poem unfolds like a miniature opera. An incisor, once part of a proud pair, falls in love with a replacement crown after its partner is lost to decay. The crown, artificial and ostentatious, cannot return the affection. She longs only to be polished, not to feel. The incisor crumbles from longing. Literally. The poem ends with a stanza you'll never forget. I crack not from sugar, but sorrow's deep bite. She dazzled in mirrors while I faded from sight. The room is silent. A few guests sniff discreetly. One man dabs his eyes with his cuff. A woman leans into another and whispers, "It's better than Racine." That's going too far, but you understand the sentiment. This wasn't unusual in 19th century France. Dental poets didn't just write pamphlets or publish in obscure journals. They performed, often with the same flair as professional actors, and with themes as grand as anything seen on the Parisian stage. Love, betrayal, longing, mortality, all filtered through the lens of enamel and decay. Historians still argue whether Dr. Corbin's work belongs to the canon of sincere romanticism or to a very long, very elaborate private joke. But his followers were, and are, devoted. At the time, young dentists in training would crowd into his performances, not just for inspiration, but for identity. To be a dentist like Corbin meant being an artist of suffering, a chronicler of the silent, the invisible, the aching. One fringe anecdote describes Corbin once attending a ball dressed entirely in white, with a gold-plated tooth necklace and a mask shaped like a bicuspid. He introduced himself as Monsieur Carey, Mr. Cavity. Everyone laughed. Then he read a 20-minute soliloquy about erosion. No one laughed after that. Back in the salon, a pianist softly begins to play. Dr. Corbin bows deeply, the way a violinist might after finishing a concerto. He accepts a wineglass, untouched, and retreats to the far end of the room, where he begins scribbling notes for what you hear someone call his mandibular trilogy. You mingle a little. Guests discuss dental ethics, the sensual implications of molar symmetry, and whether plaque buildup is more tragic in the upper or lower jaw. One woman swears that she cried more at Les Dents du Cœur than at Les Miserables. Someone else argues the incisor represents industrialization. Someone else says no, it's a metaphor for the lost peasantry. A man in a velvet waistcoat offers, or maybe it's just a tooth that cracked. You make your way back toward the fireplace, where a young couple recites a duet from another poem. She flossed, he fled, afraid of string. But oh, the root he failed to cling. There are actual applause breaks between verses. You leave with a signed booklet, Corbin's full incisor cycle, with handwritten annotations. One reads simply, "Never trust a crown that doesn't ache." Profound? Maybe. Ridiculous? Definitely. But moving, somehow. The air outside is damp with spring rain. The city glows. And as your boots click along the cobblestones, you realize you've just watched a man turn dental trauma into opera, and the crowd begged for more. You return to the city's quieter districts now, seeking something calmer, less opera, more observation. Your steps lead you to a tidy little workshop tucked behind a row of lace shops in Montparnasse. The sign outside reads Modelis Dentaires Artistiques, Poems Graves sur Plater. That's right. You're about to enter the world of poetic dental molds. Inside, it smells like beeswax, chalk, and faintly, regret. A gentle woman with gray streaks in her braid offers you a small apron and a smile that shows a perfect set of upper teeth, likely her own work. "We capture more than bite," she says in a soft voice. "We preserve feeling." And with that, she leads you past shelves of plaster dental casts, not just medical impressions, but miniature sculptures, each mounted like a specimen, with a poem inscribed beneath in looping calligraphy. One bears a perfect overbite. The caption reads, "Pressed too close in nights of fright. Her teeth clasped secrets, held too tight." Another features a wide arch of slightly uneven teeth, charming, imperfect. The accompanying poem? "I laughed too hard, I bit my tongue. But joy, not polish, kept me young." You glance around in awe. This isn't about dental correction, it's about capturing life. These aren't merely records of alignment or decay, they're portraits of personality. Each imperfection tells a story, and each story has been carved into meter. Historians still debate whether these casts were commissioned by dentists, patients, or sentimental families. Some believe they began as teaching aids for dental students with artistic leanings, while others point to personal archives from minor noble families who immortalized their loved ones through both bone and verse. One fringe theory? That some of these were actually mourning casts, taken post-mortem, like death masks, but for the mouth. In any case, the tradition gained enough popularity in poetic circles to become its own sub-art. You flip through a small portfolio labeled Castings of the Recently Unkissed. One mold is labeled only Henriette, and underneath, "He left, I clenched, and cracked with grace. Now love and I keep separate space." You're not okay, but neither was Henriette. The mold next to it shows a chipped front tooth. The poem, "A stone, a stumble, wine-stained breath. My smile broke just before his death." You lean against the wall for a second. Is this a dental studio, or a therapy session? The woman returns and offers to let you try one. You hesitate, then nod. A chair, less medical, more sculptural, is prepared. She presses the cold plaster tray against your upper palate. You gag slightly. "Think of something you want to remember," she says gently. "Something between the bite." As the plaster sets, your mind drifts. A childhood licorice stick. The metallic zing of chewing tinfoil by mistake. The way your jaw ached from laughing too long in one summer you can't quite place. When the mold lifts away, she cradles it like a newborn. "It'll take a few hours to set," she says, "but the poem can be added while it's still wet. Do you want to write it yourself?" You do. And you find yourself scribbling, almost without thinking. "For every bite I dared to take. A story shaped, a silence break. It's not perfect, but it's yours. And in this room filled with bite patterns and plaster-stiffened verse, that's what matters." She places your mold beside a drying row marked "Clients in Contemplation." She smiles again. "We don't polish anything here. Life's better with a few cracks." Outside, Paris feels different. Softer. Every smile you see, crooked, dimmed, gleaming, or gap-toothed, suddenly carries a kind of whispered poem. Because now you know, behind every arch of enamel lies a verse. You just have to look for it. You're nibbling on soft bread again. Nothing with crust. Not since Corbin's poem turned your chewing habits into a moral reckoning. But as you sit in a cafe near the Jardin des Plantes, you notice something strange tucked under your saucer, a folded flyer, barely held together with a wax seal and a bit of dental floss. It reads, "Tragedies of the Forgotten Brush, one night only." Of course. An address scrawled beneath leads you to the basement of a converted bathhouse. Inside, red curtains, creaky chairs, a small stage framed by a giant papier-mâché toothbrush. You're greeted by someone dressed like a 19th century undertaker holding a tray of cloves and lemon peels. For scent clarity, they whisper, and to prepare you emotionally. You've wandered into a niche performance, toothbrush tragedies. The lights dim. The first actor takes the stage and begins to narrate, in hushed tones, the downfall of a woman named Claudine who refused to brush before bed for philosophical reasons. Her molars stage a revolt. Her tongue becomes a traitor. Her plaque speaks in riddles. She kissed the dark, ignored the bristle, and woke to pain beneath her thistle. You snort unexpectedly and get shushed. These people are invested. This performance isn't an outlier. In 19th century France, as personal hygiene became a growing public concern, especially among the rising middle class, there emerged a wave of poetic tragedies warning against dental neglect. Toothbrushes had become common by the early 1800s, but they weren't always beloved. Some thought them a medical scam. Others believed overbrushing could erode one's character. You're not kidding. So, what better way to warn the masses than through melodrama? Historians still argue whether these toothbrush tragedies were sincere public health efforts or just another excuse for theatrical catharsis. But the formula stuck: a character with hubris, a forgotten cleaning, an inevitable downfall. Think Greek tragedy, but with more gingivitis. You watch another piece unfold. This one's called The Night He Flossed Too Late. A lonely scholar loses his lover and turns to obsessive flossing as a coping mechanism. His gums bleed. His soul bleeds. His last words? I sought the gap between our days, found only blood and mint dismay. A small woman 2 rows up gasps and clutches her husband's arm. A man in a cravat whispers, masterful. Intermission brings you to a small table lined with toothbrushes carved from bone, ebony, and even, allegedly, whale baleen. Most are replicas, though one is marked believed to belong to Baudelaire's aunt. Nearby, a placard explains how poetic societies once awarded symbolic toothbrushes to members who composed verses deemed sufficiently cautionary. You imagine a poetry slam where the grand prize is a boar bristle brush and an appointment with a melancholy dentist. A fringe artifact in the corner catches your eye, a toothbrush-shaped candle, half melted, with the inscription, "Each stroke a pen across the mouth, writing what shame dares not speak south." No one explains it. No one has to. The second act features Plaque and Punishment, a retelling of Dostoevsky's famous novel, except the crime is failing to brush after tarts. It's absurd. It's incredible. You wonder if these tragedies actually changed habits. Anecdotally, yes. At least among the bourgeois attendees who enjoyed being shamed with style. Satirical newspapers ran parody poems mocking people who didn't floss. One limerick you recall went, "A grocer from Lyon once said, I brush when I rise from my bed," but he lied with each bite, till one fateful night, his teeth fled his gums and just fled. Did it help oral health? Perhaps only slightly. But it changed something more intangible, how people talked about hygiene. It made brushing not just a chore, but a moral fable. A ritual of repentance. You stay until the final curtain. The last piece, The Bristle Widow, ends in silence as the protagonist places her lover's toothbrush in a drawer beside a yellowing poem and closes it forever. He brushed too late, and not with care. Now silence hangs between each chair. You leave into the midnight drizzle with the crowd, oddly moved. At home, you stare at your toothbrush with a new sense of gravitas. It's no longer just a tool, it's a co-author in the story of your mouth. Every stroke a stanza. Every skipped session a line break too long. And before bed, as you gently polish your tired enamel, one last line comes to mind. Where floss forgets, regret remains. In shadowed roots and mintless pains. You're back in daylight now, merciful, quiet daylight, and walking along the Seine as barges float past like slow ideas. The city has a softer edge this morning. Less poetry, more cobblestone hum. You stop in front of an ivy-draped building marked Philosophie de la Dent, Entrée Libre. It looks like a bookstore. It smells like ink and old caramel. You step inside, and within seconds, you realize this is not just a bookstore. This is a temple. Lining the walls are books upon books, some dusty, some gilded, some tied in faded ribbon. And every single one is about teeth, not dentistry. Teeth, their form, their meaning, their place in the metaphysical structure of being. You pass titles like Chewing and the Self, On the Incisor's Responsibility, and Premolar Dreams, a journal. A clerk appears. He looks like a man who drinks black licorice tea and hasn't blinked since 1843. Are you here for the symposium? He asks. Of course you are. Downstairs, in a vaulted chamber filled with pipe smoke and the sound of soft Gregorian chanting, a circle of men and women in waistcoats and scarves discuss, very seriously, the idea that molars mirror the state of the soul. The man leading the group, a tall figure with a walnut cane and no visible teeth, speaks slowly. When the ancients said bite your tongue, what did they imply? Discipline? Self-censorship? Or was it the dental sublime? This is not satire. This is the dentist as philosopher king. Historians still argue whether this was a true philosophical movement or just a highly committed in-joke by a bunch of overeducated toothsmiths. But the published work exists. Tracks like The Enamel and the Eternal and Gingiva, God, and The Void were printed in small runs and read in obscure salons by people who probably also had very strong opinions on candle brands. You listen as another speaker discusses the ethics of dental memory. If a tooth holds pain, she posits, and we extract it. Have we erased something sacred? A man in the corner sobs gently. It's not all gloom. One man presents a theory that wisdom teeth represent unrealized potential. They emerge late, often crooked, frequently cut out before their time. He recites a haiku in their honor. Silent in the back, for sages who say nothing, yet scream when removed. A few nod reverently. There's a chalkboard near the front with a quote written in looping script, "To chew is to choose." You begin to suspect some of these people have not had their teeth examined in quite a while. Still, you can't deny there's something compelling here. The idea that your bite isn't just physical but existential. That the act of chewing links you to the living world in a way more primal than prayer. You consume, you grind, you swallow, and your teeth bear witness to every moment of nourishment and neglect. One fringe theory discussed with great enthusiasm, that tooth pain correlates directly with moral conflict. The right molar aches when you've lied, says one philosopher, the left when you've withheld kindness. No one offers scientific support. No one needs to. That's not what this room is for. You flip through a copy of Ethics of the Enamel, which features essays like Can a Premolar Sin? And Love in the Time of Gingivitis. It's equal parts nonsense and strangely profound. After the discussion, the group shares a silent moment. Then they pass around licorice root, which they chew in quiet solidarity. You follow suit. It tastes like punishment and philosophy. As you ascend the stairs back to daylight, someone presses a booklet into your hand. The cover is plain, but the title leaps out. On Biting and Being Bitten, Essays in Masticatory Metaphysics. It's heavy. Emotionally. Literally. Back on the street, the city resumes. Children run, lovers kiss, bakers shout. The world chews on itself. And you? You walk a little slower. You're thinking about the last tooth you lost, and whether it was just calcium or confession. Because maybe, just maybe, there is a wisdom to the wisdom tooth after all. You're heading east now, into the older quarters where the streets narrow and the buildings lean in like they're gossiping. You follow a painted arrow on a wall, faded but insistent, until it leads you through a courtyard of cracked tile and iron balconies. Ahead, a squat stone building with an arched wooden door and a plaque that reads Académie de Mastication Poétique. Yes, the Paris Academy of Chewing. Inside, the air is warm and dry, full of dust and candied breath. You're greeted not by staff but by a disembodied voice calling from down a hallway. We're already debating bite force. Sit if you have opinions. And you do, apparently. Because 5 minutes later, you're seated in a small amphitheater between a woman in fur-lined gloves and a man carrying a jar labeled Historical Gum Samples. Do not open. On stage, a man in pince-nez glasses delivers a passionate monologue titled The Heroism of the Canine, a Structural Apologia. He gestures wildly with a rubber model of an open mouth, which squeaks every time he squeezes it for emphasis. To dismiss the canine, he declares, is to dismiss the duel, the feast, the kiss. It is the fawn of civilization. Applause. Welcome to the Paris Academy of Chewing, where learned minds debate bite mechanics, jaw aesthetics, and the poetic merit of mastication itself. Founded in 1857 by a group of disillusioned dentists and semi-employed playwrights, it was part guild, part think tank, part dinner club. Its purpose? To elevate chewing, not digestion, not speech, chewing, to a cultural pillar. Historians still argue whether the Academy was ever taken seriously or whether it was a long-running artistic stunt. But the records are extensive. Members kept minutes, printed journals, and hosted quarterly salons titled things like Chew and Tell and The Dentition of Desire. You flip through a program and find session topics such as Metaphor in Mandible Motion, Bicuspid Rhythm in the Lyric Form, Crunch, Munch, Punch, Aggression in Early Modern Jawlines. One French presenter, who smells strongly of boiled chicory, insists that chewing is the last honest human action, unfiltered, involuntary, and rich with narrative. You can fake a smile, he says, but you cannot fake a bite. The room nods. Next, a haiku contest. The theme, Saliva as Sacrifice. The best submission? Morning bread soft fades. One last chew before goodbye. Crumbs become my prayer. You feel something tighten behind your ribs. Then comes the crown jewel of the meeting, the recitation of the Great Nasha, an epic poem composed collaboratively by Academy members across 4 decades. It spans 6,000 lines and tells the story of an enchanted molar that grants whoever chews with it perfect truth. Tonight's excerpt is from Canto 19, The Sorrows of the Overbite. A woman at the podium reads, her jaw misaligned by birth and shame. She chewed alone, afraid of blame. But truth, once bitten, cracked the shell. And now she grinds her secrets well. The crowd erupts into finger snaps. Someone behind you whispers, that stanza changed my view on soup. By the end of the night, you've heard 14 odes to molars, one surrealist play written entirely in dental notation, and a limerick duel over which jaw muscle best embodies patriotism. Masseter wins. Always. As the members file out, the host offers you a token, an enameled pin shaped like a miniature set of chewing teeth. You hesitate. Then you accept it. You've earned it. Outside, the city is settling. Bells chime. A bakery closes its shutters. You chew thoughtfully on a sprig of mint given to you as a farewell gift. It feels symbolic. Everything does now. And as you walk home through the gaslit haze, you hear the voices still echoing. To chew is to live, to taste, to fight. Our molars march toward morning light. You grin. And this time, you mean it. The final days of your journey bring you to the heart of Paris's bureaucratic soul, a dusty municipal archive tucked between two shuttered cafes and a former corset shop. The marble plaque outside reads Depot Literaire de Hygiene Buckhill. Translation? The Dental Literature Archives. Inside, it's cool and cavernous. Rows of tall filing cabinets loom like forgotten ancestors. A clerk, pale and vaguely translucent, emerges from behind a rolling ladder and wordlessly hands you a pair of gloves. He doesn't ask your name. He knows why you're here. You've come for the paper trail, the scraps, the margins, the half-forgotten verses that didn't make it into salons or soirees. The real voice of the movement. And here, in this whispering fortress of brittle pages, it's all been preserved. The first drawer you open smells like talc and ink. Inside, dozens of yellowing appointment books. But not ordinary ones. Each page is covered not in records, but in rhymes. Notes like, Madame Rousseau, extraction with grace. Refuse the gas, slap my face. And this. Tuesday, 3 bicuspids gone. Patient wept, I carried on. Gave her verse with tooth and jar. She smiled, said tragic, tipped a franc. Even dentists who didn't consider themselves poets left behind fragments of their inner lives. Scribbled in the margins. Jotted beneath diagrams. One practiced couplets between charts. Another wrote sonnets about sterilizing tools. A third made tiny doodles of mouths beside every patient's name, each one a little sadder than the last. Historians still argue whether these writings were intended for posterity or were simply cathartic scribbles, secret moments of humanity inside a profession that dealt constantly with discomfort, awkward intimacy, and involuntary yelps. One folder is labeled Correspondence Entre Dentists Poets. Letters from practitioners in Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille, sharing new metaphors for molars, debating the rhyme potential of abscess, and griping about patients who refuse to sit still long enough to finish a stanza. You read one letter dated April 7, 1856. Dear Jean, I have tried thrice now to rhyme with tartar and failed. My latest attempt, my love grew hard, her smile, far tartar, is unacceptable. Please advise. Beneath, in different ink, try barter. You laugh, quietly. And then, a silence settles. Because you turn the page and find something else, a collection titled simply Verses Never Read Aloud. It's unsigned. Just page after page of aching verse, some clumsy, some exquisite, all dealing with the deeper toll of the job. They come to me afraid, in pain. I take the rod, return again. And though I smile, my hands are sore. From bearing wounds no tooth should store, asterisk. One poem begins mid-thought. I pulled a tooth that sang to me. In tones too soft for elegy. It cracked, then wept. I wiped it dry. I've not yet learned to answer why. A fringe practice documented here? Some dentists, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps sentimentality, kept personal libraries of teeth paired with poems. These weren't display cases like the gallery you saw earlier. These were private, hidden, and often destroyed before death. But a few collections survived long enough to be indexed here, each one catalogued by initials only. In the final room, past a door labeled Archives de l'Audeleur, you find a wall of drawers marked with nothing but years. You open 1847. Inside, Dozens of sealed envelopes, each containing a patient's name, date of visit, procedure performed, and, unfailingly, a small verse. One catches your eye. Jacqueline M. Date, November 3rd, 1847. Procedure, incisor extraction, upper left. She bit the thread to end her veil. Her wedding dress still faintly pale. I pulled her tooth. She did not cry. Said, "This is not the first goodbye." You sit for a moment, the hum of silence buzzing like an electric floss between your thoughts. This is what they were all trying to do. The poets, the dentists, the limerick duelists and somber archivists. They weren't just writing about teeth, they were trying to pin down something more slippery. The pain that lives in places too small for language. The ache that people carry in their mouths because it's safer than carrying it in their hearts. As you leave, the clerk nods once. "We keep everything," he says. "Even what shouldn't have been written." Outside, the sun is pale. The wind tastes faintly of clove. And in your pocket is a page you weren't supposed to take. We treat the mouth, but write the soul. In every crack, a whispered hole. You don't return it. Your final night in Paris arrives like a slow exhale. You've seen the clinics, the salons, the libraries, the black box theaters full of molar metaphors and bleeding gums turned into ballads. You've witnessed dentists become bards, teeth become testaments, and toothbrushes treated like sacred scrolls. But tonight, you seek no more stages, no lectures, no jars of weeping incisors. Just one last walk. You find yourself near Montmartre, where the streets turn steep and the stars feel closer. You climb slowly, your feet dragging with the weight of 24 pamphlets, one illegal archive page, a plaster cast of your bite, and at least 3 philosophical crises about floss. You crest a hill just as the wind picks up, and there it is. A single lantern glows in the window of a crooked little shop marked Cabinet d'Ivoire. It's closed. Of course. But you press your hand to the glass and peer inside. Within, rows of patient chairs lined up like pews. A workbench littered with brushes and quills. And above it, scrawled across the back wall in flaking gold paint. "Here, we rhyme what others pull." It's not fancy. It's not archived. But it feels like the heart of it all. You sit down on a nearby bench. And you remember. The dentists who rhymed during extractions. The poets who wrote from the tooth's point of view. The mourning mothers who wrote sonnets to lost molars. The lovers who slipped verses into rinsed cups. The molars displayed like saints. The broken crowns turned into metaphors. The flossers who wept. The grinders who confessed. And through it all, the unspoken truth humming beneath the verse, that the mouth, of all things, is the place where we hold everything we can't say. Historians still argue whether the movement had lasting value. Whether it was art, or coping, or just very committed marketing. But you know now, it doesn't matter. Because in a century when pain was constant and medical comfort inconsistent, the French turned to language. And when language wasn't enough, they went smaller. Into the mouth. Into the enamel. Into the roots. Into the spaces between. And there, they wrote something human. Not perfect. Not always beautiful. But honest. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Because long after the gauze is discarded and the numbness fades, after the teeth are pulled or fall out on their own, what remains? The story. The metaphor. The quiet poem whispered through clenched jaws. You lean back. The city breathes around you. Somewhere, someone laughs with a chipped tooth. Someone else cries into a handkerchief that smells faintly of mouthwash. And you? You pull out one last crumpled page from your coat and smooth it on your knee. I spoke in pulp. I wept in root. But still, you heard my aching truth. Though teeth may crack and breath may sour, the verse remains. The verse has power. You don't know who wrote it. But tonight, it feels like yours. Now the streets are quiet. The poets have gone to bed. The dentist's lamp flickers out one last time. And somewhere, in a drawer lined with velvet, a gold crown rests atop a poem no one has read in years. Your breath slows. Your jaw softens. The ache that once pulsed behind your gum line is gone, or maybe it just learned how to hum in harmony. You picture the chairs. The pamphlets. The cast of your own bite drying on that little wooden rack. You remember how the wax clung, and how the words came after, not because they had to, but because you couldn't leave without them. The wind outside your window sounds like pages turning. You let it blow gently across your memory. No more sonnets tonight. No more limericks about plaque or incisor duels. Just this. A smile. Slightly uneven. Still yours. A silence. Slightly tender. Still full of meaning. You close your eyes and imagine a molar, perfectly white, floating in darkness like a moon. Around it orbit the voices you've heard, reciting and reciting, until everything becomes still. It's been a strange journey. A painful one. A poetic one. And now, at last, it's time to rest. So breathe in. Breathe out. Let the verse dissolve like sugar on the tongue. Let your jaw unclench. Let the ache become memory. And let the memory become a lullaby. Good night, dear listener. And don't forget to brush. Sweet dreams.